24 ordinary college students volunteered for what seemed like one of the easiest psychology studies ever conducted. They answered a newspaper advertisement, passed a series of psychological evaluations, and were promised $15 a day to participate in a 2-week experiment. None of them had a criminal record. None of them had a history of mental illness. They were healthy, intelligent, and by every measure, completely normal. 6 days later, the experiment had to be shut down. Not because someone escaped, not because of a technical failure, but because the students playing the role of prison guards had become frighteningly abusive. The students playing prisoners were suffering emotional breakdowns, and the line between role play and reality had begun to disappear. This is the Stanford prison experiment, one of the most famous, controversial, and disturbing studies ever conducted on human behavior. And it began with a simple question. What happens when you give ordinary people power over other ordinary people? In the summer of 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo believed he could help answer a problem that had troubled society for decades. Every time reports emerged of abuse inside prisons, the explanation was usually the same. The guards were bad people. The prisoners were bad people. The violence came from the individuals involved. But Zimbardo wondered if that explanation was too simple. What if the environment itself was responsible? What if ordinary people placed inside a system of unequal power gradually began to behave in ways they never imagined possible? To test the idea, he transformed the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a mock prison. The hallways became prison wings. Storage rooms became solitary confinement cells. Steel bars were installed. Doors were reinforced. Rules were written. Uniforms were prepared. Everything was designed to feel real. The researchers then selected 24 male college students from a much larger group of volunteers. The participants were carefully screened. Anyone with signs of psychological instability, criminal tendencies, or medical problems was removed from consideration. The final group represented some of the healthiest and most psychologically normal young men available. The researchers randomly divided them into 2 groups. Half would become guards, half would become prisoners. The assignment was completely random. No one was selected because of personality. No one was chosen because they seemed aggressive or submissive. A flip of chance determined who would wear the uniform and who would wear the prison number. At first it seemed harmless, almost like a game. Then the arrest began. Without warning, local police officers arrived at the homes of the participants assigned to be prisoners. Neighbors watched as the students were handcuffed, searched, read their rights, and placed into police cars. Many had not informed their families exactly how realistic the experiment would be. To everyone around them, it appeared they were being arrested for actual crimes. The prisoners were taken to a real police station. They were fingerprinted, photographed, processed, and then transferred to the mock prison in Stanford's basement. By the time they arrived, something had already changed. The experience felt real. The guards arrived separately. They were issued military-style uniforms, mirrored sunglasses that prevented eye contact, and wooden batons intended only as symbols of authority. The sunglasses would prove especially important. Behind them, guards could watch prisoners without revealing emotion. The human connection began to disappear. Each prisoner received a number. From that moment forward, guards were instructed to address them only by that number. Not by their names, not by their identities. Just a number, a small detail, but one that quietly stripped away individuality. And that was when the transformation began. The first day passed with surprisingly little conflict. The prisoners adjusted to their cells. The guards learned their responsibilities. Researchers observed from nearby rooms. Everything appeared calm. Then the morning of day 2 arrived, and the prison exploded. The prisoners barricaded themselves inside their cells. They pushed beds against the doors. They refused orders. They mocked the guards. They staged what amounted to a prison rebellion. For a brief moment, it looked as if the experiment might collapse before it had truly begun. The guards responded with something no one had instructed them to do. They organized. They developed tactics. They armed themselves with fire extinguishers and forced open the barricades. The rebellion was crushed. The prisoners were stripped, humiliated, and punished. The guards created reward systems, punishment systems, psychological pressure. They divided prisoners against one another. And what was most disturbing was that none of these methods appeared anywhere in the experiment's instructions. The guards were inventing them on their own. Something inside the environment was beginning to take control, and with every passing hour, the roles became harder to remove. By the second day, the prison was no longer an experiment in the minds of many participants. It had become reality. The prisoners stopped referring to themselves by name. They began answering only to the identification numbers sewn onto their uniforms. What started as role-playing was slowly replacing their sense of identity. Some prisoners became withdrawn and silent. Others obeyed orders automatically, even when they knew they could leave the experiment at any time. The line between choice and submission was becoming blurred. Then came the first serious warning sign. One prisoner suddenly began screaming uncontrollably. He cried, cursed, and demanded to be released. At first, the researchers suspected he might be faking in an attempt to escape. But as his emotional state worsened, it became clear that something was genuinely wrong. He was removed from the experiment. Soon afterward, another prisoner suffered a similar breakdown, and then another. The psychological pressure inside the prison was proving far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. What made the situation even more disturbing was that the guards were not being ordered to act this way. Most of the cruelty emerged naturally. The guards discovered that authority gave them power, and power encouraged them to push boundaries further and further. Meanwhile, the researchers were becoming participants in their own experiment. Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist leading the study, had taken on the role of prison superintendent. Instead of observing from a distance, he was now part of the system itself. As problems developed, he often responded like a prison administrator rather than a scientist. The experiment was no longer being controlled by the researchers. The experiment was controlling them. Outside observers began to notice that something was wrong. Parents who visited were disturbed by the conditions. Some questioned whether the participants were being treated ethically. But the strongest challenge came from someone who saw the prison with fresh eyes. A young psychologist named Christina Maslock visited the facility. As she walked through the basement corridors, she witnessed prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads. She saw exhausted young men being treated less like volunteers and more like actual inmates. She was horrified. Unlike everyone else involved, she had not become accustomed to the environment. She immediately confronted Zimbardo. She asked a simple but devastating question. What are you doing to these people? For the first time, someone forced the researchers to view the situation from the outside. The question struck hard. Zimbardo realized that he had become so immersed in the experiment that he had stopped recognizing how extreme it had become. The next day, the study was terminated. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. It ended after only 6 days. The Stanford prison experiment quickly became one of the most famous psychology studies ever conducted. To many people, it appeared to reveal a frightening truth. Place ordinary individuals in positions of power and powerlessness, and the situation itself can transform their behavior. The experiment became a symbol of how environments, institutions, and social roles can shape human actions. But the story did not end there. As years passed, researchers began re-examining the experiment's methods and conclusions. Critics pointed out that some guards may have been influenced by instructions from researchers. Others argued that participants were acting according to what they believed was expected of them. Questions were raised about whether the experiment truly demonstrated the power of social roles or whether it reflected the unique circumstances created by the study itself. The debate continues to this day. Yet regardless of where one stands on the controversy, the experiment left an undeniable mark on psychology. It forced researchers around the world to rethink the ethics of human experimentation. It influenced rules governing psychological studies, and it remains one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how quickly human behavior can change under the right conditions. The Stanford prison experiment began as a simple question about power. What it revealed was far more disturbing. Sometimes the greatest danger is not a few bad people. Sometimes the danger is a system that encourages ordinary people to become someone they never imagined they could be. End. Subscribe.